Just adjust this here. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to just doing a morning show. I don't even have names for these things anymore. But I decided to go ahead, come out. It's a beautiful morning here in Maine. And today's topic I wanted to talk about a little bit. And I'll take some of your questions if you're around, if people pop up. I know it's very early on the East Coast here, and I usually get an early start. We're out in the garden today. But I want to talk about the difference between a civil war and a revolution. And as much as anyone today, I'm probably qualified to talk about it. I mean, I wrote The Coming Civil War, and I was telling 2 years ago about what would be happening today. And when you look at what I wrote in Incoming, which was the sequel to it, I predicted that there would be a third party elite that would try to play the left versus the right and to utilize existing problems in society. And this is nothing new. It's actually interesting. I've been I'm taking a break from reading Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, which is basically globalism for globalists 101. And it's a great book. I mean, it's actually really thoughtful and it's well developed. And it's refreshing to read history absent propaganda, where it's incredibly brutal, but yet it makes the argument that, ultimately people they try to keep people in certain places because otherwise we end up in conflicts we can't control. And that's kind of where the theme of today's show is. We're going to talk about the difference between what a civil war is versus a revolution. And mind you, everyone may have a different opinion about this, but I've put some thought into it lately in my own work because, I work on an incipient nation building up here in the Atlantic Northeast. And the difference to my mind is civil war is when you have a fight between existing factions in a system. So the left and the right, the capitalist and the communist, the market and the state, ultimately, who should have primacy. And it's ultimately a situation where they're not really fighting to change the system that works. They're fighting to see who will have control over it. Because I think if you look at the broad strokes of the far left and the far right in this country, for the most part, they're just fighting over who will have control over the government. And that is why this cultural civil war that has sprung out in the streets quite a bit isn't going to the next level just yet because both sides are fighting for the ability to impose control over one another. But ultimately, in that fight, they're not trying to fundamentally change the system so much as they're trying to take possession of it. You don't see people calling out the banks. Once upon a time, just talk about for a second, once upon a time, the radical, or I should say the right wing in America was concerned about moralism and about tradition and Christianity. And while there are plenty of culture warriors who are a big faction and a necessary one to the right's victory, the leadership class doesn't really believe in that, as evidenced by their own policies. Open borders, free markets, they just want to make money and work for their own self aggrandizement and live in a society where they can enjoy material wealth. And if you look at the radical left, once upon a time they spoke about poverty and the elevation of people who are at the bottom, but now they've switched to being culture warriors, which honestly is probably one of the reasons why they're being so successful. They're fighting a culture war against people who can only see it in a political context. But in the end, they just want to take charge and they don't want to really change the system either, other than that they want to use it to control and dominate people and having an advancing form of national totalitarianism. They are going down the Stalin Mao road as opposed to what Lenin and Trotsky might have done. And I think they know that. Maybe they don't. I don't know. But in any case, both sides have reached the point where they've abandoned people for a systemic battle where they are not trying to move people in their awareness. They're not trying to build a new nation. They're not trying to advance new ideas so much as they are just trying to take control of the system. And they manipulate people in different ways. The right plays to the economic interest of business owners, saying that you'll be impoverished, which is true, and the left plays on the racial anxieties of different groups to motivate them to action. So that's a civil war would look like two factions fighting over the scraps at the table. But a lot of times civil wars lead to revolutions. And why does that happen? Because the sides that come to power realize A, the situation's changed so much the system isn't worth anything, or B, that a new revolutionary ideology is necessary to go past this. And this is where we're at, the question of what a revolution looks like. And a revolution, in the truest sense of the terms, would require something major to change. You would have to change some major structural element of what America is. It could be the borders, it could be the makeup of the people, it could be the key institutions. You could say, for instance, that we are going to abolish the central bank, we are going to change how money works in this world, we are going to make it so that we have an economy based on production rather than finance, that it's on credit rather than debt, and you could do a lot of different things that would make it much more accessible to the people, and it would upset the basic power structure, which is a few people at the top controlling a lot of people at the bottom. And that would be a revolution for humanity. It would ultimately, ironically, be a spiritual revolution in the sense that it would allow people to pursue things that are more meaningful to them, but it would also be a political one in the sense that it would see the distribution of wealth quite differently. But it doesn't happen because the left fringe and the right fringe are busy fighting over control over the system as dissident elites, while the center is going through with an idea that their own revolutionary ideal, which I believe they actually support, is transhumanism and the idea that a few people will use technology to leverage control over the entire society, and that they will ultimately be able to, as a result of that, be able to control everything and everyone, and then they will remove people as much as necessary so that they can be successful. And so when you look at what's happening, if you think that that's the revolution hiding behind the curtain, then things start to make more sense. For instance, take coronavirus, which I've covered in depth. We have these stories of people who get very sick from it, and we know they're true. We also have these stories of people who didn't even get tested being told that they got sick, which I've seen the evidence for and I believe are also true. So what's happening? What you see is a leverage point to destroy society on the one hand that is also being used. I get an early start sometimes. And good morning to everyone saying hi to me, by the way. It's I come on when I feel like talking. That's what it is. The great thing about YouTube is my thoughts are recorded, and I do my best thinking in the morning, so I sometimes like to come on early to share it with people. And hey, enjoying the drive into the town today? Traffic and the sevens, right? So anyway, but no, I'm just talking about things that are interesting to me that popped into my head because I do my best thinking in the morning. And why wouldn't you? You're fresh, you're thinking clearly. But what I was going to say is when we're looking at this transhumanist revolution, ultimately with respect to COVID, what I was thinking is happening is that we are being set up for a fall. And I talked about the dream I had about that. But moreover, it's the idea that you have to destroy a thing to make a thing. And if you control demolition in the same way that you might buy up a dilapidated block in a city and tear down a condemned building to put up a new skyscraper, at least when people still wanted to live in cities. And in the same thing, we see that level of social deconstruction happening now, where the old things that people held on to are the far left is being used to destroy people's belief in the structures that built our civilization so that we will not have a ground on which to stand against what's being done. And it doesn't mean that the elites are going to go ahead and work out for the interest of the people. That's not the case at all. But it means that they know the most effective way to use tools is to shoot water in a certain direction. So they use money, of which they have a limitless supply, to take people, which they have very low regard for, and push them into directions where they will attack certain structures that stand in the way. And what they attack is morality, because ultimately they want to live in a world where people have needs without ideas. They have the desire to meet purposes that they require without having any more pragmatic principles, or not pragmatic principles, but just philosophical principles. And so a revolution does that. What it does is it destroys the way you think. And so if we're going to launch a revolution against this, a counter revolution, which is necessary, by the way, because ultimately we're not going to be given a choice. The choice will be submit, be destroyed, or conform. And presuming you don't like any of those, it means people who don't like each other are going to have to work together. And that's really hard. And look, I'm coming to you from someone who has been seen as a right-wing voice for a very long time. And it's not so much that. It's more that I believe in, how should I put it? I believe in our social traditions. I believe there are timeless values, but I also believe that we need a return to communalism and forms of identity that are not just based in the individual. Obviously, we have individual rights, individual liberties. No one's contesting that. But the idea is you need group identity as well, in as much as you agree to certain ideas upon which you will fight against this. And so that's one of the things that I've been working on really hard, is how to do it. And so I went back to my books, of my New Albion books, and I was looking at what Atlantic nationalism looked like as a way to do this. And we had basically done the right-left paradigm in a sort of reverse faction, where we went ahead and we said, okay, we want this, they want that, let's fight them, see what happens. But we don't live in a vacuum. As much as I don't like how people choose to live in Boston, Hartford, New York, Atlantic City, Philadelphia, and D.C., and Baltimore, especially Baltimore. I mean, there are people there, and that if we end up fighting against one another, ultimately the people who will win will be the people who will be horrible to all of us. And some people won't realize it because honestly, they'll give enough material to support to the people they want to keep around. but that is not much of a future. And I reminded, as I often am when I get confused about these things, of my Christian calling to reach all people. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is revolutionarily think of ways to have the government work differently. And we have reached the point in the West where if our civilization is going to continue, we are probably going to have to destroy much of our state. And I know people aren't ready for that because we have gotten to the point in our own helplessness where we think we need the state to sustain us, whether it's to impose our values, whether it's to push forward the material needs we need. And it's not to say there's going to be no state, but it needs to be a fundamental reassertion of the relationship between people. But it's not just as simple as saying, hey, I'm going to have liberty to do what I want. It's that people are going to have a revolution toward responsibility, towards spirituality and commonality. And so this is a mental break that people are going to have to have. You're going to have to take much more responsibility for what happens in your life. You're going to have to take responsibility for people around you and talk to people about things they don't want to hear, call them out on their BS, and speak truth whenever you can. And we're going to have systems that recognize we don't all agree on things and we don't have time to reach agreement and concord. I wish we did, and we need to, and it may just work out where areas can do that. But what I think is going to actually be necessary is that we need to rapidly develop alliances to devolve this state in a way where we can basically cool off a nuclear reactor that's going to blow. And I say that because if America blows up, we might have a dark age for a couple hundred years. And I'm not upset with the idea of a dark age in and of itself, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot to be said for finding wisdom instead of intellect. But unfortunately, we live in an age of wonder weapons whose horrors are unknown even to us. And if it comes to that outcome, we don't want to be there to see it. So what does that look like? And that looks like mass separatism that's going to have to require our ability to agree to disagree and to work about it very quickly. And so what does that look like? Let's talk about that for a second. What I did with New Albion was something very, very clever, which was I decentralized a whole bunch of things, including the money itself, to the community level. By that, I mean the county level. The legislature we put in there was at the county level, so that it didn't matter what state governors tried to do, how they tried to impose or not impose upon people. If also, the federal level, you can't give a lot of power there. Federal government should only do a couple things. They should have borders, okay? They should have militaries to keep you safe from what's outside. They should invest a little bit in the culture and not so much in one favor. But you want people to have a common identity. That's important. And make sure that the education system works and that people are united. That's all government should do. I mean, there's we could quibble at little points of it, but most stuff should be local. And if you have a disparity of different groups doing things, that's fine. You prevent monopolies. You can't have monopolistic businesses either. You should have small businesses and tax revenues in a way where you don't allow big businesses to run things. So you can't end up with Google endorsing cancel culture, and you can't have all these corporations basically paying to have people riot in the streets so that they can go ahead and steal money through the central bank. And you have to get rid of the central banks. They have to be gotten. I was actually reading Carroll Quigley that made it very clear. There was something he said that I'd never thought of as clearly as this before, but he said something that was smart that I want to share with you. And he said that money is the opposite of production. And it sounds kind of crazy, but think about it for a second. It's really true, because if you have one product, let's say that's for sale, then it's worth a lot of money, right? If there's the last of anything. Let's say, you remember a few years back, they had those stupid Tickle Me Elmo dolls kids were going nuts about, and parents were paying an insane amount of money. The profit margins were off the hook, because remember, profit is the means by which you make it appear that real money is legitimately obtained. Okay, that's all profit is. Profit saying, it's okay you charged me too much because I wanted it that much. You have to understand the psychology of economics. But if you had 10 of them, it's only worth so much. Or if you had 100 of them, it's only worth so much. And if we got to a point where scarcity was not the issue of economics, what ends up happening is that money itself becomes immaterial to the equation. No one thinks about how expensive the air is that we breathe or the water that I'm drinking, because we think that these things are just built into the system. And the truth of it is, everything is built into the system if you look at it from a certain perspective. You can say, well, that's just a right. But what happens is money exists as a means to use control. That is the social capital aspect of it, by going ahead and serving to say there's a limitation on this. And the people who realize that purposely play games with the money supply, and they use debt and credit in ways where they gain power by limiting access. Money's job is to reduce your ability to have choices. People say it's a store of value and a medium of exchange. Those are technical definitions that don't describe the psychological active networking function that money accomplishes. And money isn't a store of value because it's been losing money due to or losing value due to inflation. It's been a means of maintaining control, and it isn't, as far as a medium of exchange. It gets shut down all over the place. And now that it's not worth gold, I mean, realistically, it's not sound either. So all it is a mechanism of control used against people. Does there need to be a means of exchange between people? Absolutely. Will money be a necessary evil in a world between men in a material status? Probably. But the point is that if we want to change how things work and have a better life, the answer isn't the state telling people to behave a certain way. I mean, as much as I'd like it, the answer isn't even a church going around doing that. We tried that in the Middle Ages, and that didn't work either. And the answer definitely isn't the market saying, hey, we're just going to trade anything whenever we want, and that you're going to have it, because that creates the hole in the system whereby the control mechanism that is even more deadly, by which our politicians are controlled, by which the riots are being pushed, and by which a few people can control the future of all humanity, goes forward. And what's needed is something very different. And what we are going to go ahead and have to do is figure out a way to do that. So what I have tried to do in my own micro sense, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get a lot of flack for it, but I'm going to try to modify the new Albion model enough to be able to encompass the big cities on the coast. And I don't expect them to go for it, but I'm going to try to solve the problems of Boston, of New York, and Philadelphia, where there are a lot of smart people. Who are a lot of good people. They just look at the world differently and see if there isn't a common ground system that can be better than what we have, where we don't fight over control. And I don't know all the answers to it, and it's going to be a conversation, and I think it's important to have that conversation now and quickly. But one of the things that I'm going to do with that system is emphasize the importance of decentralization. So what works for Philadelphia County, Kings County, Queens County, Suffolk County, I mean, that's Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, respectively. Those sort of things, they can have their own things. And I think if we go small enough, it works. If you divide New York into every neighborhood, where instead of having someone like Bill de Blasio running things, or, Marty Walsh over there in Boston, you could have, or Lori Lightfoot in Chicago. The model doesn't just work for the Atlantic. You could have a situation where what you would have is you'd have a bunch of small towns in close constrict with each other, none more than 50,000 people, and you have direct democracy at the local level, and you have one person above the thing says, hey, I'm just going to keep an eye on things. You do what you want in your areas. And if you want to have black communities that are all black, maybe like in the Bronx, okay. And if you want to have white communities that are all white or Christian or whatever, you find the means of separation within them. Hyperlocalism that allows for peace and intercultural constructs. And if people want to live together, which I think most people will, that's fine too. I mean, that will be the majority of people. And then you just go ahead and you let people separate into worlds that make sense for themselves, and that we can have meaningful existences and find a way to hopefully reset the common values and buy ourselves time. Because at this point, that's the race we're dealing with, that we need. And we need common enemies, and I would submit the common enemy to humanity. I call my party the party of Concord. This is the party of discord. They want to use money to control each and every one of you. They're paying people off, and it's not hard to see. I said, I put something together where I was working out where there were 4 classes of people in the sort of New Albion project. We called it the Knight, the Steward, the sage, and the what was the other person, the farm worker. That we were looking at this idea of who would promote grace, who would promote reason, who would promote nature, who would promote loyalty, and that all of these roles are necessary. But who stands against that? It's the big banks that make money out of thin air to control you. It's the corporations that sell you as a commodity. It's the your big pharma type people who promise health and only want to make money off sickness. All of those sorts of people, it's the people who exploit the land and who have no desire in looking at the health for other generations. And it's the academics who teach the discord and division. And at the root of it, you look at what the ideology of globalism is, and it is evil. It reduces man to his strictly material form. And so I'm going to go into theology for just 1 second, because it's really useful to understand this, and it gives people an insight I don't think people are prepared to have. But I think you need to understand this. You have to understand the function of Satan theologically, and whether you're a Christian or not, the Christian construct basically governs the way the West works, so you can understand the larger principle. And if you think about the origins of Satan's revolt against God, and really man's revolt against God follows the same thing, it's this idea that the world is unjust and that man is a mistake. Ultimately, Satan fell from heaven, or Lucifer, if you want to put it that way, because he made the argument to God that God made a mistake in man because man's fallen nature is an affront against God. And so, therefore, to prove his case, what Satan and what evil does in this world is it always tries to make man into such a reprehensible being that we literally are not worthy of salvation, either from each other or from heaven in the larger sense. And when you look at what the forces out there push, the value of discord that they push is they try to make us do reprehensible things to one another and to treat each other as objects so that literally we destroy each other just like mad animals, or how should I say, possessed beings. And so I make that argument to you because when we look at our system, what we need to do is stand for what's good and remove what's evil. And the idea that we seek dominion over one another as objects, I think, is a universal evil, because it negates the idea that we are spirit-filled beings that have souls and that every person is capable of redemption and is worth saving. And I think we need to be willing to go out there and fight that battle. And it's not the same battle for every person. It's not a political battle for most people. It's a revolution in thought. It's a spiritual battle. The church used to do this before it cared more about being liked by people and attended than it did speaking truth. And that's where the reason comes into it. Truth is seeking the highest good at all times, and reason is the capacity we have to seek those things, to understand and resolve contradictions. And revolutionary thought is nothing more than the ability to get past seemingly impossible paradoxes and build upon knowledge so that hopefully we can have a better awareness of the world around us. And nature helps immensely with that because we see that, and in grace we try to do that. And if we work in loyalty to one another, and that's how we survive this thing and lead more of our people to salvation, both in this world and in the next, if you're a Christian like I am. So those are sort of the ways that I'm thinking about things, and I'm trying to go out there and talk about it, because what prompted this video today was the collapse of proprietarianism. Now, some of you may know, if you don't know the movement, very, very briefly, John Mark and Kurt Doolittle were working on something where they basically infused libertarianism with this idea of stronger legal functions, and that they were going to make property apply to non-material matters like the quality of life. It was an attempt to apply the liberal idea, and I don't mean that in a left-wing sense, but I mean in a classical sense of property. That is to say, something you deserve and have the right to possess, as something that is a collective identity that was held. And it is an interesting and useful thought. I don't think that the strategy they had for success as a political movement works, but there was something interesting there that's worth pulling out as a kernel of truth, that there are things that we have a right to, or that we have a desire for, let's put it that way. Right is too strong, and we should seek to maintain, which is the safety, for instance. Safety is a quality, and it's a big quality of what I've been pushing for some time. I actually learned that doing Coronavirus Central, just how central safety has to be to the argument. And it's not something I care about as a crazy Slav revolutionary, but it's something a lot of people care about, and rightly so. I mean, why not? Because that's perpetuity. That's protecting your family, your children. And we tried to do that with COVID, and now we're trying to do that with politics. And I'll say, if anything we do politically is ever going to work and be useful, it's going to need a lot of women involved, and it's going to need a lot of men. It's not so much that you're going to have women being the leaders of the group, although some may rise to that level, but it's more about the fact that they understand the need for continuity. That's women's role in culture, always has been. Why? Because they have kids and they want to protect them. That's nature. And if you begin connecting reason and nature in the arguments you make, you have better outcomes. But with the proprietarians, they basically ended up walking into a political trap in Virginia that destroyed their movement. And from what I've been given to hear from them, what ended up happening was they were being set up for another Charlottesville. And to some extent, it looks like they definitely got out of the mess they got themselves into. It would have been better had they not walked into it, but they did. But John is basically, as best I can tell, decided to walk away from it. And I'm not really sure what Kurt's doing. But what I am sure of is that the whole idea, they were in the Civil War mindset, that they wanted to go out there and they thought that they could go ahead and provoke one side to get strong and organized enough to win this fight. And the ultimate problem is that they're dealing with a group who are trying to build an organic identity out of ideology, and it doesn't work that way. Ideology is the means by which existing groups effectuate their desire to power. It's not something that works if your group isn't already in place. And their argument was that, well, the group of pissed off Americans who want the old way is enough. And maybe they're right. Maybe it will come to that. But I don't think that's the best way to do it. And so I got out here and I started talking a little bit because I've been thinking a lot about how you can do it in a bigger, broader way. And literally, I am thinking how we lead different states and provinces straight out of the Union and Confederation for the Canadians up there into something better. And that, ultimately who works in those groups. And it's no secret who I work with. I talk to farmers, I talk to people in the countryside. I can unite people on the right pretty easily. That's not that hard. And a fair presentation of the policy makes the argument. But being able to talk across the ideological gap is harder because what cancel culture does so brilliantly is it makes it impossible for you to have a conversation with people with whom you disagree. And you could have a useful, productive conversation. In fact, the most useful conversations you will ever have are with people who logically disagree with you and who can articulately make their points. Tucker said that yesterday, and I think he's right about that. That if you go out there and you can talk to people like on the left, okay, what can we do together? Healthcare, we could do that together. Environmentalism, we could do that together. Looking out for the welfare of children, we should definitely do that together. And the idea you need to be more involved with your community. And I've come to realize that you need those instincts. And what the left does is brilliant at the local level and a disaster at the national level. And why is that the case? Because you need people involved in your community, stepping in there, doing more. But when it gets to the point where you believe in something so much you want to impose everything on people, that's where the evil slips in, because the ends justify the means. And the means are what you have to consider at all times. It's the motives by which you do things. If I just wanted to be an ends justify the means guy, you could go out there and you could grab a dozen guys who have the capacities to go out there and basically destroy this country in about a week. I mean, you could probably do that with a Spetsnaz group if you knew the right targets to hit. And look, I write books about Civil War. I could figure all that out. But you're not building anything. You're just destroying things, and you're destroying civilization, and you're destroying mankind, and you're destroying not just the lives of people, but the spirit to aspire to something higher. And that's the morality of it, that you can't do it that way. As much as there are times you really would want to, and that you get so angry and so hurt, on all sides, to be fair, that you start thinking of it that way. And that's not an answer either. I mean, it's not an answer I would want to go down. I could argue that, and I have argued that, and I just don't think, I don't think that's the pathway that we need to take. And I'm not saying that because I fear violence. Quite the contrary. I've considered it deeply for many, many days and weeks and hours. And look, I've had years to think about a civil war and what it would mean. And there are worse outcomes. I mean, I would rather deal with a civil war than a Bolshevik takeover. And I'm very clear about that in my writing, and it may very well just come to that. I mean, we are basically fighting a long shot battle, but I think that ultimately we are going to have to figure out some way to go ahead and build a new center, a new radical center. And I've used Concord as a word, and I've put out these different concepts that work on it. But we are not going to be permitted to by the media. And so what we are going to have to do, honestly, is it's almost like a right-wing Robin Hood, right? You're going to need like a Sherwood Forest. We are going to have to do things to destroy the institutions that are destroying us. And what are these? These are the colleges, these are the banks, these are the tax collectors. And to a sad extent, it has been the organizational law enforcement. And I don't mean the rank and file law enforcement people who are trying to do a good thing, but they need to realize that the what would you call it in Chinese? The imperial mandate is gone. The FBI is serving to oppress the people of the United States. The police departments are not keeping people safe, but they are now becoming the secret police. The Stasi of the state at this point, and that requires people to be individually responsible, to work together, and to recognize that law and authority is broken because we live in a country where our leadership lacks legitimacy. And whether you like Trump, whether you like Biden, whether you're a Democrat, whether you look like Republicans, the legitimacy is gone because we, the people, do not support them. When we have a Congress that has a 10% approval rating, when we only like 40% of our leadership, that is not a country anymore. That is a train wreck in slow motion. And so we have to break it. We have to break it in a way where we can pull the pieces back together. We need a clean break and a heck of a lot of super glue. And that's what it's going to take. And if that means breaking off regions, I had a great conversation with a friend of mine from Texas who was telling me how bad things are getting down there and that they're looking at things differently. Or my friend from Idaho who I talked to at some length. And, maybe it has to be in different pieces. Maybe it's all one piece. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that this is where we're at in this situation, and we don't have a lot of time. And that's why I'm working. That's why Free Atlantic Radio is coming, so I can take some of these ideas and try to put it together and see. Maybe we can put some people behind it. It's going to take a militia. It's going to take a separation. It's going to take a lot of things where really quick the idea of independent nations have to form. And so the question ends up being a simple one for each and every person listening to this, because I think in posterity, people will go back and look at some of the things I said earlier in light of things I will do later. and say, what do you want from a nation? You may love the idea of America, but do you love an idea that exists in reality, or is your nation still that way? And if it isn't, what are you ready to support? What would you believe in? And I think all of us need a fresh start. It's a toxic relationship where our state exploits us, where it treats us very badly, where the political process has lied to us so many times. I mean, look at the last. Let's go back to 2000. Take the last 20 years. The hanging Chad election, right? 9/11. We were promised that we were bringing democracy to people when we were going over there, messing over there. The cynical actions of what happened in Iraq, that whole mess. That was a disaster. The bailout that happened for the rich and took houses from the poor and put people upside down for 10 years. Shovel-ready jobs that didn't happen. Solyndra, right? All of those things that were just lousy. I mean, community policing from the Department of Justice, where they basically ran guns to the militants. The Tea Party, where they didn't accomplish anything except open borders and more tax cuts for the rich. The Ron Paul people, we tried to get the Constitution back in even the conversation. You couldn't do it. The Republican Party shut it out. The Republican Party, let me tell you something, is one of the most clever ways by which the elites keep control. They've been using the Republican Party for 150 years. The Republican Party was the party of the liberal elite on the East Coast that was used to protect mercantile interests. That was why it was founded. It wasn't founded to fight slavery, and it wasn't founded for individual freedom, and sure as heck wasn't founded to express traditional morality. Go look at the comments of people like Nelson Rockefeller and go back through the history of it. They've never done that. And the Democratic Party has always been a means just to mobilize people to an end. And these are what the parties have done for a very, 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 very long time. And if you understand that, you can see those problems. And what do they all do? They do it in service to the people who pay their bills. That's the bankers. And ultimately, it's really interesting. If you start studying the history of Reconstruction America, if you go back and you find the foundations for your beliefs, what you'll find is that it was actually the big wealthy financiers in the guise of populism that made it impossible for the parties to raise money independently and made them poor so that way they could be more easily bribed. It's one of the most fascinating things where it looks one way to the public, but it works the other way in private, because the truth is patronage is an essential element of humanity as people look out for their own. And what they did was they set the law against the tendency of people, and when you put reason against nature, you end up with discord. And that's what we do over and over again. And so when we start looking for solutions, we have to recognize that people are going to have those issues. That's why you're better off having a few people who make a lot of money, who make decisions for you, who are not through a political process that is prone to corruption. And that's what an audit risk would say. But we apply these ideas, these ideals of, ridiculous levels of civic virtue to people who have absolutely no reason, no desire, and no experience of practicing them, and a process that deliberately is designed to weed them out. So that's why democracy fails, and honestly, that's why republics fail too. So we're going to need something very different for a while. We're going to need professionals to come to the front, a group of revolutionaries who have a new idea, and to set up a system that then rationally, calmly brings the best people to the front. And New Albion tries to do that. We basically have an idea where you have the mayor come up to be the county leader, the count, and they work their way up to Duke and progressive responsibilities. So eventually you have a monarch that's picked by their skills and talents that they earn from being from their people who live there and who have been originally been selected and have shown the ability to have progressive responsibility. And they've learned how to do the legislative process, they've learned the judicial, they've learned the executive, and they've learned ultimately that what you need is a soft hand on the tiller. You need to go ahead and guide people. When you're at the top and you have a lot of power, you have to use it very gently, like Augustus did. But if you have to impose a lot of power, people aren't going to listen to you because you're ultimately forcing them to act. And if there's one thing we know about Americans, it's that we all come from rebellious backgrounds and we don't like being told what to do. So instead, we must be shown a way. And I think that is the better way forward. I think that's the revolution in thought that's necessary. So, and that is what I'm going to continue trying to work on. And I do fully expect to be demonetized, shut down, kicked off YouTube, kicked off everywhere. And that's fine. I've accepted that. I've accepted I live in a post-financial world. People will support me or they won't. And in any case, the world goes crazy. I got to do what I can to fight it. I saw some of you had some questions, so I will go back. Excuse me, my luck, I'll probably die choking on water. But hello to everyone who's here, by the way. Thank you for listening. I appreciate that. Let's see. Morning, everyone. Contrarium writes, Tom, could you situate this philosophy in a larger geopolitical context? How is a hyper-local, decentralized government supposed to come up against other powerful geopolitical actors? Great question, Contrarium, and I actually struggled over that greatly. It's one of the reasons why, with my project, I'm reaching out to the East Coast as we do this. You know, you're talking about a country here. If you were to combine the greater Northeast, we would have, and by that I mean, think of it from the Potomac River north, basically, and that's not even including the Canadian provinces that would be included in that theoretically. You would have a country that would have the purchasing and military power of Japan. So you would have the capacity to do that. And I think that it's important to take the military function and separate it from what's happening domestically. You know, the Holy Roman Emperor did this to some extent, and that we could work out through nuclear deterrence, through other actions, and make sure that we are safe and that we don't have to deal with things. And I think having rational borders would be a part of it. I actually believe that the model I constructed would probably work best in an idealized state where you would have the Midwest and Northeast join together, the South and Texas join together, and the West be its own separate entity. And I think it's actually important to bridge some of the left-right divides in there and recognize there are deeper cultural similarities. You know, as much as things are going terrible in places like Seattle and Portland, they have a lot more in common with let's say Boise, than they realize, and they have a lot more in common between Boise and Seattle than say Boise and Bangor up here in Maine. So I think that that's one part of it. I think that North America would do well to keep foreign powers of large import off of our continent, and I think an alliance between different people to do that, between the left and the right, between the cities, recognizing that using external actors is a road you don't really want to go down, is very smart. So we have to be aware that if we get into a civil war, and this is why I argue for revolutionary thought rather than a civil war at this point, will lead to those geopolitical actors using their interests, not around the world just. I mean, around the world, yeah, Russia will move on Ukraine, Taiwan, China, all those places. But more importantly, that they will have an interest in seeing us destroy one another and remove a threat. And it could take 100 years to come back together in anything useful at defending ourselves, and we could be balkanized, and North America could be the new Africa. And I know that sounds crazy to people because we have such wealth and status, but it's very hard to rebuild from the ground up, and it's very hard from a practical perspective to rebuild in the absence of resources and when people are in discord and unhappy. Conversely, it's very much harder ideologically to move along and reform, but reform we must. And finding a way between those two poles is a necessity imposed upon us because of this external threat. And some people would say, well, isn't that an argument for trying to hold the U.S. together? It's the best argument for it. But the problem is the U.S. government is screwing over the U.S. people, and the U.S. people will end up suffering too much for it. We can't keep kicking the can down the road, and our political system is incapable of solving the problems we have. Number one, a financial system that goes ahead and dominates us and makes more people poor so that it can maintain its status. Number two, the fact that our Congress is for sale basically as rent-a-cops, using the U.S. military to serve foreign interests in wars. Look at all the wars we fought over and over again to try to A, hold this country together, and B, serve the interests of those client states which send money to us. And C, it's proven utterly incapable to meet and improve the quality of our people. We have become a warlike people detached from any sense of goodness, who have nothing in common except what we can take, what we can steal, what we can grab, and what we can gather. And the anger has become overwhelming, and we have become a people not worthy of salvation. America was founded not by the Constitution, but by people like the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came over here with compacts to seek a greater good in providence and divinity, and that we wanted to have the good life for ourselves, for our children, for our families, in peace, and in seeking the higher things in life. And we are so far away from that, we don't even ask the question, how can I survive? How can I pay my bills? How can I do these things? And so we have to break our own system. We must break the empire, and empires always arise. This is not abnormal. We inherited a lot of things. Our best actions got us in a lot of trouble. This happens to all sorts of nations throughout history, where they have to grow in response to certain challenges, and the decisions they make to grow become entities unto themselves. We never went home from the war. After we shouldn't have gone into World War I, and after World War II, we never went home. We've just been fighting over and over, and we've exhausted all of our moral resources. We've exhausted our economy. We've basically traded our own productive wealth in exchange for financial development, where we just became consumers. And ultimately, all we have left is nothing. We've exhausted our social capital. We've exhausted our restraints on each other. And we just have whatever potential our people has and the need to desperately reboot. And that's where we're at. And so when you ask the question geopolitically, what does America need to do? America needs to take care of its own for a little while, but I don't think we are one nation. I've read different books. Some people say we're 9 nations, some people say we're 11 nations. I say we find these different nations and let them explore where they want to go. And if some of them are on different bases, that's fine. Some will lean left, some will lean right, some will be more ethnic in identity, some will be less ethnic. I think that's fine. And if we can all agree amongst one another, like the German states used to, or the Italian states, that we will unite to keep other people out while we solve this, that's probably good enough. And I think that's a realistic proposal for how we fix the American problem and how we go to de-balkanization. But the problem is people's determination, their stubborn, dogged desire to say, well, I'm going to be emperor of this whole game. We don't need emperors. We don't need people running us from the Potomac. And honestly, what we need is the American people to declare war on D.C. We need American people rioting and taking down every Federal Reserve Bank. We need American people throwing out this garbage that's on TV and this cancel culture that makes us all hate each other. Look, I have no problem with any group feeling good for themselves, but you can't tell the majority they're to blame for everything. They built this country. Do you not see the psychological warfare being conducted by the elites against it? And why are they doing it? Because they are not nationals. They don't believe in any country. They believe they're above anyone and that this is all just politics and games that people play. That is literally where we're at. So that's what I thought. So Carrie asked a question. Please define a post-financial world. A post-financial world, in my mind, has to be a place that we ultimately are going to need to get away from this idea of interest and debt obligations. That we have, if we have trades in the future, they will be simple trades where we don't have compound interest, where we don't have deep debts. And I think here's how you start. I think that you need a reset. The first step of the reset is a debt jubilee, the cancellation of all debts and the beginning of a rethink of a new currency. Maybe it's rooted in energy. There's a lot of thoughts on that. It's a deep conversation. We should have it. I'm not necessarily wedded to any one solution. Number two is we should try to root everyone on some property where they actually own it. And I mean that in the sense that there will be no longer property taxes. You will own land, so you have a place that is yours for you, your family, your progeny to own, to sustain, to build upon. When you have food to feed yourself, a roof over your head, and an understanding that's not going to be taken from you, ultimately, when you're in that position, then you can begin thinking intelligently about questions and the question of trade and ownership, and that you work to make sure that big business and big government cannot come back. How do you do that? You make it so that the law is structured in a way where that small businesses can succeed and big businesses can't take them over. The trade-off is clear. You will have less stuff, but the stuff you will have will be of higher quality, and it will provide more support to your communities, whether you live in a big city or a small town. You will have a decentralization of economic development where now you will have wealth come to small towns and big cities alike, and you will have people have the ability to diffuse themselves where they can live in an environment suitable how they want. I think we've seen with COVID, and I think the future will bear this out, that people will choose to live in less densely packed areas, that they will want to be able to live in the country. And so many people have said to me over the years, I want to be able to live in a place like that. How do I do that when I have to pay these bills? And what you do is you change how the bills work, and you say, look, all of these debts are erased. And for a time, does that mean it's going to be hard? Absolutely. It means we're going to have to live on subsistence for a little while in the same way you would after a bankruptcy. That's not uncommon. And people are always promising, you don't have to deal with the pain today, you deal with it tomorrow. Let's deal with the pain today. Let's reset our currency, and we can do some very smart things. For instance, an idea I had for the upper Northeast is we could build hydro turbines on the Bay of Fundy. The Gulf there jumps like 40 meters on every tide. You could power all of the Northeast off of that, and you could do like they do in Alaska with the oil dividend. Everyone would get a check. Everyone could make some money. Everyone could have health care. And you say, these are our people. Let's build a culture between us. You keep people out for a while, except people who really want to be here. And you don't bring people in to replace people for work. You bring people in because you think they're going to fit well in your society. And you understand what your society is about. And what you do is you take yourself out of the banking paradigm where you're always trying to have balloons and bubbles. And yeah, there will be cycles in life, and things will go up and things will go down, and that's okay. But what you'll find is you live closer to the earth, closer to nature, and closer to a sustainable life where the relevant portions in life is not your possessions, your material status, or really the idea the West has chased for 400 years that wealth is somehow going to make us happy. But instead you have the key value, the most precious thing we have in life instead of stuff is time. So you spend your time looking at things that are important to you with your family, meaningful relationships. Maybe you have, and I don't have a problem having a shorter work week. I don't think the idea that we work 40, 60, 80 hours a week is good. Let's focus instead on people doing things differently. And that's one of the places we could have a conversation about it where we balance our lives better. And instead of asking what we must do, why don't we ask what we should do? That's what I think a post-financial world looks like. And it's hard to get to because ultimately it requires people to go ahead and say, hey, let's all reset to a common bottom and just be people again. But people like having control. They like having dominance. Some people like it because they're sociopaths. Other people like it because of the convenience. Other people think it's a matter of justice, that they worked harder to get there and they deserve it. And that's actually a pretty compelling argument in a lot of ways. But you're doing that at the price of destroying that which you built, because you have basically, you've built your castle on the sands of the beach and a hurricane's coming. So you may have built it and you may have put your energy into it, but can you sustain it? And if you're willing to be honest about that question, I think you would say the answer is no. And as such, that is the way you have to do it. And I think that those are the things we have to kind of figure out, how we put firm foundations underneath us. And it used to be that there was faith was a foundation. That we shared one faith and we agreed to work on that. And I know it's not as simple as getting back to that, but I think opening our hearts to that possibility is important. Family is something we have to get to fast. Mothers and fathers working together for children, and children looking out for the older generations. How many young people hate boomers? Let's be honest about it. It's one of those things where we don't have intergenerational links anymore, where we don't learn from one another, we don't work with one another, and we're all trying to dominate one another because we're all saying who has stuff, who has control. Instead, let's be part of a team where we work together, and husbands and wives need to come back together. And look, I'll just put it this way. The family is the foundation of civilization. Always has been, always will be. If people want to have divergent relationships, that you really need to, how should I put it? If you want to have divergent relationships with other things, they have the right as adults to do that. That's fine. But the state shouldn't recognize those things, and they shouldn't put more energy into these sorts of things because they're not what's going to build your foundation. Families build societies. It's just the way it is. And it makes sense. Men and women are different beings who each bring something remarkable and irreversible to one another. I couldn't do what I do without my wife, and she makes me a better person. And I like to think, hopefully, I help keep her afloat, because without her, it wouldn't work. And I think we need teams like that. And when kids grow up seeing that teamwork, when they see that men and women can work together, that there's not a war of the sexes, and that really builds the foundation for a better future. I also think the state needs to get out of education altogether. I do believe kids need to be educated, but you should have a choice as a parent, and you shouldn't be basically held hostage sending your kids to whatever school, then whatever the state wants to teach you, and basically making you rent your property to do so. That was one of the mistakes that was made very early on. The founders would have been aghast at that, and it has been part of the plan, honestly, going back for socialist manifestos for many, many years. The idea you want schooling, fine, absolutely good. Homeschooling is great. Community schooling is great. Whatever you want for your children. But you need to have options, and you need to be involved, not passively sending your kids to school. And I think having the time to do that and resetting the society a little bit would be good. So yeah, I'm trying to put some ideas together that would be helpful in a way that is very pragmatic and approachable. All right, let me read what else you've been writing here. So yeah, Kirk got himself in trouble. I agree with that. Whoops. I'm just reading through your thoughts here. Thank you for those who are reading my books. I appreciate that. And thank you for the kind words, Daniel. I appreciate that too. It almost seems futile. People would march to their death for a good cause, and hopefully I'm going to do something harder. Let's try to march to life, man. This is what we need to do. And up here in the Northeast, I'm building it town by town, idea by idea. I'm reaching out. I'm building groups into the coalition. We're talking to different towns. We're talking to dissidents, and we're talking to people who've been abandoned by the state. Law enforcement officers are one big group. A lot of them are beginning to understand the screw job, and to activists on all sides. There are people who are here, but mostly it's just going to be people who know how to be leaders in the community who say, we don't want to be a part of this. And I tell you what, give me 1,000 good men and I'll give you a new nation, because we can stand and say we will not go home, and it's not violent. I'm not looking to fight anybody, but we ultimately need to go out there and say we will not participate and we're out of this. And when they come forward, say, no, we're not going. These are our homes. You're not taking it from us, and you're not going to dominate us. We aren't going to let DC dominate us. I mean, would you be willing, and let me ask you a question, because I'm just thinking aloud, would you be willing to go ahead and stand on something, if I called it the November 4th movement, where we say we won't accept either Trump or Biden, that we demand that we be separated? that we be separated, that we go our separate ways in our various states. And what Texas wants, and what Maine wants, and California, and county by county, state by state, we just say, DC, we are taking power from you, and that we are going to do something different, and that we're just not going to do it. And what does that mean? Well, you'd have to stop sending them tax money. You have to stop sending them authority. You just have to not listen to the government. I mean, the truth is, they're getting rid of the police anyway. They're creating anarchy. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. But what I know we need to do is we need to disempower these people. The idea that people say, well, you're causing the problem. You're voting for X, and that's why you get Y. Don't you realize? They're two wings on the same bird, and that bird don't hunt. You know, that's the way it is. That's how it is, and that's how they control you. You are. We live in a system where we're given 100 false options to distract us from the one that makes sense. And that's why you have to use reason. You have to use reason to seek out that good. And if you can't figure out, hang out in nature, man. Hang out like I am. There's a reason when I do my morning shows, I'm out here, out in on the countryside on my back porch here with all these plants. It helps me think. And I'm going to go back when I get off this in a couple minutes. I'll go and I'll read my book and I'll try to figure out more. And, you know, there's no money in it. Lord knows there's none of that. But ultimately, these are the questions that need to be asked. And I think that when we ask those, we have a better idea. So let's see what else you've been asking. Thank you for the kind comments, Jewel. Daniel asks, any ideas on how I could get through to my children and educate them about the truth you explain clearly, because evil is misdirecting them towards lies and idolism. Yeah, idolatry. Let's see. So that's a great question. I think with children and education, the best way to teach is through demonstration. I find that over the years of speaking, I've had a lot more luck by using metaphors rather than describing principles as absolutes. So people like to be shown things. So if you can find ways to demonstrate what's happening and ask, well, like if someone has a belief they strongly hold, I usually go ahead and I acknowledge the belief. I honor the instinct behind the belief, and I'll be like, well, okay, well, what happens if you do this and if you do that? And every ideology has contradictions, and if you want to remove someone from their contradictions, you just go ahead and point out, be like, okay, well, let's say we got that. This sounds like a good idea, but then what happens with this and with this? And let them see the consequences of their own thoughts. Let them see in action what happens. Most people, when they get into an argument, basically say, I'm right and here's why. What you really need to learn to say is, okay, what you think is interesting, here's my issue with it. And learning how to change how you answer is the key to persuading people when you do these things. And there's different levels, and some of it's cynical. Like, for instance, they used to have these political campaign schools. They went something like this, where they would teach you to have 3 conversations with people about stuff that was so inoffensive you'd agree on everything, because then they'd assume you have something in common, and then they'd agree with you automatically on something they didn't know about, because they say, well, he's a good guy or she's a good woman. I'm going to support them. But when you're dealing with somewhere where there's already conflict, you have to de-escalate the conflict. You have to go ahead and pull the kernel out and say, okay, well, what is it you're really trying to accomplish? Acknowledge and validate the beliefs of the person you're talking with, even if it's a child, and say, okay, well, that's an interesting idea, but what about this situation? And let them see the contradictions. If you can do that, I think that's a much better way of going forward. It's not an exact science, and sometimes people are going to disagree. That's part of it. But hopefully, Daniel, that will be helpful to you in your effort. Okay. When I talk about fault lines, do I think we will eventually not be able to cross certain boundaries in the United States? I think it's very possible that in the future there will be borders in very different places. I think that now is a good time to be living in a place that makes sense to you. I do not presume we will be one country. If a civil war happens, there will definitely be boundaries you will not want to cross, and they will probably be in the inner suburbs between cities and the countryside. And I think that certain regions will probably work differently from one another. There will be zones of controls where that will happen. So the idea that you have ultimate social mobility, unless you're willing to go out there and play John Rambo, you're going to have some problems. So you probably need to be investing time and energy in getting to where you want to be in a place that makes sense for you. You can see what I'm doing in the upper Northeast. I mean, there are places that I think are safer, but you need to be in a place that makes sense for where you think. And if you're not there, I would say it's an existential crisis. You need to be making those moves now, and you can always get another job. Remember, if you center your life around money, you're ultimately choosing to live or die for money. I would ask you if you think that's worth doing. And I know some people say, I don't have a choice. Sure you do. You just don't like your choices. But this is what happens when you have inaction and you don't take accountability for your own actions. And to be very fair, let's be clear. We have a system that has been created where people have specialized skill sets that basically serve to keep us hostile, or not hostile, captive within a system. We need to get to a future awareness of ourselves where we all have a certain baseline general skill set. If everyone owned land and everyone could garden and everyone could feed themselves, if you ended up leaving your job in whatever your specialization is, it wouldn't be the end of the world because you could sustain yourself for a little while going back to the land. I, in some ways, was blessed to have this awareness because I got fired involuntarily, but I had a contract and I was smart enough to have that and to negotiate my way out of it in a way where I had time to think. And you don't get time to think, it's the most precious commodity. As an adult, and I spent that year and a half, was I was writing some books and I was just going out and seeing the country. I was learning that we were fighting for a world that wasn't satisfying nearly any of us, and that we needed to ask different questions. And I think that people need that space in their lives. You know, the idea that you just go work for 30 years, get worn down to a nub, and then end up retiring to get a pension and sit there and think about what you might have done, that's no way to live. And you know, the founders and the settlers, they understood that. They lived dangerous, difficult lives, but they also lived lives of choice and action. And that bringing true choice back into the equation, which you could do only when you have ownership of your own self and your choices, is really what's going to be key for us if we're going to go forward. And so I understand in this financial construct, we can't get there. I also understand this financial construct is destroying itself. And what is going to ultimately be offered, I think, is an effort where people who are loud dissenters will be moved away. Those who adhere to the system will get money to be quiet, and that ultimately people will be removed through one malady or another, whether it be war or famine or economic downturn or the virus. And we'll all be told these are acts of nature. These are not acts of nature. They are nature being weaponized by men to evil service against one another, probably with supernatural forces behind them. Go read Revelation 6. You can read it. This book is not a new story. But ultimately, you have to be aware of those things. And if you're going to do that, you have to work for something good. You know, Christians try to do that in taking care of our enemies. And we get laughed at a lot for it. But we do it because we don't want people to be our enemies. We want people to be our friends. And we want souls to be saved and people to be happy. And you look like an idiot doing it. Believe me, I know, because I'm a pretty cynical person who does some not cynical things. But those are the sort of things you have to do. And when you have a healthy nation, you do the same thing. When someone comes to your community, you look at them as an asset and an opportunity, as someone who can bring something there, bring something special to the table. But that only works if we can agree on certain ideas and if we can be honest with one another, which is why the elites pay for systems that don't allow us to talk. Because when we're fighting each other, they can get away with absolutely anything. And they have, and they do, and that's what we deal with today. And that is the crisis of the moment. And so against that, people rise because they can see the problem, but they don't understand the solution because they see one level of it. They see the political level, or the economic level, or the legal level. But it's like an onion. The deepest level of the problem is a spiritual level where we hate one another and we have nothing to bind us together. So the revolution is a revolution in thought of binding us together in a society where we go ahead and try to make people better. And no one has ever said that, I don't think. People don't try to have a better nature. We don't try to improve our nature. We try to improve our material status, or we try to improve our position in societal standing. We don't try to become better people. I invite each and every one of you to become a better person and to help me in my ongoing effort to become a better person. And how do you do that? Well, you ask questions, you look at the world, you pray a lot, you take time and you think about issues. You don't just act and react. You think and you deeply consider. You know, you take a day off. Like I might go tonight. In fact, I might go today actually because I'm sort of feeling like it if the wife is up to it. I might go for a hike for 2 miles. And why am I doing that? Because I want to think. I want to reason things out. I want to say, wait a second, A doesn't connect with B, and I don't want a fast-out solution provided for me. I don't want to say, hey, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. Because the one thing that happened to me, I had lost faith in a lot of humanity. But it's hard because Coronavirus Central was a dear thing to me. And what ended up happening was a lot of people who were in it, who I really liked, turned very hard, very fast. And I'm like, these are decent people. Why are they turning? Why are they mad? Why am I mad? And I was so mad. There's some people, and I know there are provocateurs who go in there and they try to do these things, but I don't want to be in a position like that. I want to be able to, even women from Ontario, I want to be able to get along with them. Lord knows their heart's in the right place, even if their head is somewhere else. But we need to be able to do that. And I try to do that with laughter and with disarming. And look, do I offend people? Yeah, of course, because I'm honest. And I think that is something we all need to learn to do. And And for me, I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to lead the thing. I mean, because I don't see anyone else trying to do it. And am I the right guy? I mean, I don't take things serious enough. I mean, you should see how many people send me emails. Why don't you wear a shirt and tie? I'm not trying to terrify you. I'm trying to educate you. I'm trying to teach you things. I'm out here playing Aristotle up in the garden. Where I live in Maine. It's a beautiful place. What's his name? Thoreau came up here into the Maine woods. You can read about the place where I live and where I have chosen to reside. And I'm a transplant. Some of you know I grew up in Phoenix. Um, and you just have to find a way to reset to a better world. And if we could do that and pull enough people along, and at some point, yeah, will it take something tough? Yeah. Some people, some men, maybe some women, mostly men, though, because women shouldn't be fighting. Sorry, but that's the truth. I mean, you should fight, but different battles. You fight for your family. Men have to fight for society. It's the way it is. You go out there and you fight these battles, and you do so in a way where you say, hey, this is where we stand, and we will back down no further. Where are your red lines, and what are you willing to take back? And ultimately, our civilization's in the balance, and we are trying to deal with something that wants to have a post-human, mechanized civilization, and we could say, no, we're going to invest in humanity. And that's the structure, and that's the revolution I think we're fighting for. So I am fighting for people, and you know what? I'm fighting for souls, and if I die, if I were to be kidnapped tomorrow, if someone comes throws a bag over my head and I get taken to some FEMA camp, or God knows to South Portland, which would be even worse, ultimately I'll be able to say, look, if I die and I die, I'll face the Lord and be like, I saved souls, I saved lives, I tried to be a good man, and I was brave, and I was courageous in as much as I knew how to be. And was I right about everything? Maybe I was wrong, but I did what I thought was right. And I just did what I thought was good instead of what was easy. And that's what each of us has to do now. So I'll say a little prayer here, and then we'll call it a day. I've got an hour, and I didn't plan on going that long, and I want to get back to my book. Because I think I'm actually going to go on my hike on Saturday, just because if I was really going to hike, I got to get an early start. My wife starts real early, and she's going to have me out here. I'll actually show you real fast before we do this. You can see the garden, that's my knee there, is going nuts over here. So you can see how much greenery there really is. Let's see if I can hold this up just a little bit so you can see. We got all those tomatoes, although the fight I've been having against the deer is literally reaching Elmer Fudd-ian type proportions, which is not a great thing to have, but that is my struggles. The Lord gives us challenges for us to overcome so that we can learn lessons. And I think if you can approach, one of the best things that you learn in Christianity is that if you can approach challenges with a thankful heart and the opportunity they give you to grow, you're a much happier person. So maybe that'll be the theme for the prayer today. Heavenly Father, I just pray that we learn to be thankful for the challenges that you throw before us, the opportunities for growth, and the chance to learn from one another and learn from this world you've given us, that we can do so with grateful and an appreciative heart, knowing that it is through your grace that we have the chance of salvation, and it is this world that keeps going. It is not the devices of man which we build, from government to machines, which always break down and never rebuild themselves, but the life which you have instilled in each of us that is threatened, and that we need to learn to value as the most cherished possession, the time we have here with another in this world and in service to you and one another. So I pray, Jesus, you guide my words, and you guide all who listen to this broadcast, and those who don't, to find a way to wisdom, to help one another, to reawaken the spiritual within us. God bless each and every one of you in the Lord's name. Amen. That's how I look at it. You guys all have a great day. Thank you very much for being here with me for a little bit this morning. I will be back, what's today? Thursday. Friday night, I will be on the show, and expect me on Tuesday instead of Monday. I have to go do something where I will be unavailable on Monday night. I actually am going to be on a Christian broadcast talking about what Christians should expect. So I may post something about that once we get the time of it finalized, because people are asking, and I would say dangerous days are ahead, but building friends and people around you are the means to surviving them. Please make sure you do that. God bless each and every one of you, and have a very great day.